When it comes to Rick and Morty, there are a lot of characters who only look out for themselves. It's a show with lots of memorable bad guys. But between the assassins, beings of godlike power, and people controlling a corrupted system, who is the most evil? I'm Kyle with Wicked Binge, and this is Rick and Morty Villains, Evil to Most Evil. For this list, we'll be covering the characters who we think rise above the rest and have earned the title of villain. That means we have some criteria for them to meet. First, they have to have been shown to either threaten to do harm or have harmed a significant number of people and/or one of the main cast. They also have to be a focus for at least one episode. And finally, if it was shown that a character was working for the greater good in the end, or they were redeemed through some great action, they will either be low on our ranking or be freed of the title of evil completely. For our first ranking as least evil, we have Phoenix Person. While Bird Person is an undisputed ally to Rick, we did have to include this version of him on our villains list. After he's revived and brainwashed by Tammy and the Galactic Federation, Phoenix Person is quickly used as a tool against Rick. We can't help but feel bad for Bird Person being turned into a weapon against his best friend, just because he fell for a young woman who wound up using him. But we can't argue that all the brainwashing made him a very dangerous enemy. Hopefully, with the new season of Rick and Morty, Bird Person will be redeemed now that he's in Rick's care. Next up is the dog Snowball. Once a nice little dog that needed some extra training, he evolved into a very vengeful canine. But, to be honest, it's hard to blame him for it. Snowball's anger made sense. He recalls all of the time he felt neglected and humiliated before banding together with other dogs. But Snowball also shows compassion to those who didn't hurt him, mainly Morty. He hates humanity but recognizes that some humans, even if the number is few, are kind enough to leave free. And Snowball's fear of losing Morty to some illness is what compels him to leave the Earth and start a society elsewhere. It's not often we get a villain in this show that's able to be defeated through relatively peaceful means. Sure, it did mean that Morty went through a lot of pain, but it is that kind of show after all. But Snowball was, surprisingly, one of the more human villains, and for that, we love him. Next on the list is Freddy Krueger-inspired Scary Terry. Just like the horror slasher that inspired him, Scary Terry thrives on the fear he creates in people as he hunts them down. But unlike Freddy, Scary Terry is a much more reasonable guy. We learn that he takes on the role of a terrifying nightmare figure because that's what he's been trained to do since he was a kid. As soon as Rick and Morty learn about how Scary Terry was bullied in school for not being seen as good enough and how those memories still haunt him, they show the villain some kindness, which leads to Terry becoming a valuable ally. Of course, he still exists, terrifying people, but we give him a lower ranking on our scale of evil because he does come around for our protagonists. Next up is Zeep Zanflorp. Arrogant and intelligent, he's seen as a copy of Rick while still thinking himself superior to C-137. While his actions could be labeled as immoral, being a replica of what Rick had put his own people through, we can't label Zeep as being the most evil. After all, Zeep explained himself that he left school at an early age to pursue his interests, and those interests all revolved around making his life and the lives of his people easier. While Rick engaged in a form of slavery just so his ship and a few other electronics would work, Zeep wanted his people to not have to spend every moment of every day fighting to generate power. He used another life form like Rick had, but Zeep wasn't so selfish as to use all the energy for himself. We're not saying it was a great solution to their issue, and there were surely more humane ways to free themselves from the labor, but we give Zeep credit for having his heart in the right place. Next up is the President. Though he had proven himself to be a pest to Rick and Morty, we don't have it in our hearts to rank the President any lower. It makes sense that Rick would start to rebel against being used as a safety net when he's given tasks that translate into little importance. And the President honestly should have expected it. But all the power went to the man's head, and he, of course, tried a few different routes to get Rick back under his thumb, none of which went well. The man couldn't even be happy when Morty and Rick became responsible for issues getting resolved, even though the duo gave the Commander-in-Chief all the the credit. At least he appears to have learned his lesson. Our next spot goes to Mr. Meeseeks. He gets a lot of leeway because he wasn't initially a bad guy. In fact, none of the Meeseeks were. They had a clear understanding of life and its morals, but were driven by completing a small task no matter what it was, and having Jerry be such an issue drove them to the edge. Of course, the ringleader Meeseeks wasn't technically wrong. If Jerry was dead, then it would logically mean he wouldn't be able to get a poor game in golf anymore. When they had their final confrontation with Jerry, holding the kitchen staff hostage, Mr. Meeseeks gave another desperate statement, clarifying that they were acting to accomplish the one thing they wanted, to cease existing, and if that meant resorting to extremes, then they were going to do it. Though taking innocent people hostage wasn't the best way to approach the issue by a long shot, we do recognize the desperation the Meeseeks faced, and we can relent that they did try their best to help Jerry before they snapped. Taking the next spot is Reggie. A neglectful father to his and Gaia's children, he shows up after Rick and Beth build up a functioning society on Gaia's surface. Considering how many deadbeat parents are hinted throughout the show, including Rick, we aren't placing him on this list for that alone, though it doesn't help. Our main reason for placing him as a villain is simple. He's a jerk. To Gaia for leaving her hanging. To Rick for beating him to a pulp. To the family for putting them in danger. And most importantly to his own children as they were killed in the conflicts. Not all of those deaths are on Reggie exactly, but he certainly didn't help. Next up are the Zygerians. Long story short, these guys are a nuisance. They invade Rick's space and are constantly trying to trick the man into giving up his secrets. Specifically, they wanted the recipe for dark matter, to the point that they had no issue spying and extracting information about the Earth and the people around Rick in order to get it. Had they not been defeated and ultimately killed off by Rick, they would have been capable of causing a lot of damage while trying to gain more of Rick's secrets. The only thing we can say in their defense is they don't really have a great sense of focus when it comes to their overall goals. When Rick inputs the code to his safe and the hologram comes down, the prince sounds hesitant and like he's just making things up as he goes along, keeping Rick strung along for the joy of tricking the scientist. Moving on to the story lord. He's a lot like Reggie in that he's a very arrogant jerk who comes off as someone that just wants to throw his weight around and show off how powerful he is. His motivation is a little scattered, but it's clear that he detests Rick and wants to drain all possibility and inspiration from the man. Every artist's worst nightmare, whether it be writing, painting, directing, or anything else, is to have their work stolen and butchered. Seeing Storylord expose possible twists and plot points to feed into his own power and enjoyments was stressful to say the least. How he was defeated was unexpected and a bit cringy, but it was a relief to see him taken down. Next, we have the maid, Lucy. Like some other characters on our list, Lucy was once a very good person. She was sweet, she was humble, and she was committed to her job because it meant being around something she was passionate about, even if she couldn't be a part of it in the way she wanted. But once she spends time with Jerry, she desperately holds on to the interaction and uses Jerry's obsession with the Titanic reenactment to live out her own fantasies. When he begins to pull away, no longer interested in giving her time or attention, Lucy snaps. We rank her lower on our list for her obvious premeditation. No, she may not have planned to run into Jerry and be with him exactly, but she did come to work with a gun and had clearly thought about how to go about such an attack for some time. She went in that day, and likely many other days, ready to finally take out her aggression on someone else. Moving on to the devil himself, Lucius Needful. We aren't totally sure what satisfaction Lucius really got from cursing objects and having people use them. That part is never really explained. Sure, they learned a lesson or got punishment for their greed, but we don't really see Lucius benefit from it. We'll guess that it must have been important to him since Rick destroying his store and plan demoralized him and made him want to go back to hell. But to then turn around and use the one person that stood by you is a really horrible thing to do. Summer isn't perfect, but she didn't do anything wrong to Lucius, and got thrown aside by him anyway. Lucius being beat up by Summer as he thrives in the spotlight was very satisfying. Next, we have two villains together, Cop Morty and Big Morty. Since these two were seen working together, we have to rank them pretty close. Both had a disregard for the safety of any other Ricks and Mortys on the Citadel so long as it meant an easier life for them. Cop Morty was exposed as killing his former partner just because that Rick didn't want to play ball, and nearly did the same again with his new Rick. Big Morty had no problem ordering various hits on whoever was being inconvenient, targeting the Morty Locos in particular due to their tampering with bootleg portal fluid and causing a competition. Moving on to the ruler of Pluto, King Flippy Nips. He's your typical selfish king. He wants his people to be happy, even if it meant they were only content due to the lies they were being told. In King Flippy Nip's case, he lied to them about Pluto still being a planet. After all, so long as they still thought that Pluto was doing okay and not shrinking, they wouldn't protest the mining that was putting the king in such a life of luxury. King Flippy Nips was so determined to keep the facade going that he even condemned his own son to a life in prison, because having his son free meant having someone on the loose that had proof that Pluto was shrinking and had been properly demoted as a celestial dwarf. Pluto may be a cold place, but King Flippy Nips' heart is much colder. Taking our next spot is the Federation agent Tammy. A former friend of Summer, we see her first in the Meeseeks episode where she begins to take an interest in the family. After a party, she quickly uses the chance to hook up with Bird Person and marry him, using the wedding as a chance to gather several wanted criminals including Bird Person and Rick. Being a Federation agent and exposed as a villain was bad enough, but her treatment of Bird Person was downright shameful. This man had really fallen for her, and she greeted his plea for mercy with gunfire, only to turn around and use him as a puppet when he was revived as Phoenix Person. Seeing her killed in the conflict later on was a relief after all the damage she caused. Neither of these groups would like this, but we're placing the Council of Ricks and the Galactic Federation together. And that includes the Shadow Council of Ricks that was revealed when Evil Morty took his place as president on the Citadel. Both of these groups share a lot of similarities. And we're not just saying that because Rick did in an early episode. We see that life under both groups is run in a pretty similar fashion. With the Federation, they keep people compliant with a bunch of pills and meaningless titles and promotions. They know people aren't going to rebel if they see more positives than negatives, and so help with such things as giving robot servants and increasing the longevity for horses and other creatures. The Council of Ricks has no issue with seeing those lower in the rankings having a hard time with life on the Citadel. They put Ricks in empty jobs and make them happy by trying to give them a Morty to boss around. And the Mortys are taught to be subservient and accept whatever their paired Rick wants to do. Both are horrible setups that don't really meet the needs of the people they're meant to take care of, and so both will be labeled as evil organizations in our book. Next we have a more minor villain, but a memorable one, the agency director. He's shown when Rick accidentally finds himself in their institution after turning himself into a pickle. This man wasn't shown on screen long, but he fits nicely into the role of your average villain in a dark espionage film or superhero movie. He's shown to hold people hostage, torture people, kill people. We even see him off a couple of his employees on screen before he tries fleeing, just so he didn't have to worry about any leaked information or sharing any of the money he was hoarding away. We can't rank him much worse since he's not on the same level as many of the other evildoers on this show, but he certainly isn't someone you would want as an enemy. Moving on to King Tommy. We're cutting him some slack for two reasons: his trauma and the need for survival. We've said it before on a previous list, but King Tommy was left behind to die because of Beth as a young child. He was left in an odd world where he wasn't sure what to do and had to have some way to feed himself, so he made do with what he had. But we still have to drop him low on this list due to the fact that he let this simple need to eat in order to live turn into a very disgusting pastime. He made the creatures he created see him as a sort of god, and just accept that the less desirable of them was to be eaten. That is an incredibly twisted way to live, and it warped his views enough that when Beth stated that his father was being accused of having eaten him, Tommy's first reaction was that parents should eat their children, We don't have very high hopes with how well Tommy is doing now that he's cloned and in the real world again, but only time will tell if he'll be an issue again. Moving on to one of the most famous Ricks, we have Toxic Rick. C-137 is a menace enough, but take away the few redeemable traits he has or the small amount of guilt he feels about anything, and you're left with a man that wants the whole world to suffer the nihilistic worldview he's condemned himself to. Now, we can't rank Toxic Rick any worse because of the actions of many who were hit by the toxic beams. After all, it's very hard to say if he really intended for children to maul a man in a costume to death. His only real saving grace was the love he had for his grandson, which is what caused his downfall to the healthier part of his personality. Next, we have Beth's mythologue, the more aggressive and evil one anyway. While Jerry's mythologue also caused a lot of damage and bloodshed, we have to give this spot to Beth's as the creature was the mastermind behind the breakout of their containment and was the one who wanted to create an army to rule over the galaxy. This creature wanted to rule not because she had plans to improve life, but simply because she was strong and she could, using the Jerrys she created from the real Beth to have others that could be easily manipulated. This creature would have been relentless had it been able to expand its territory. Just from the damage it did at the retreat alone, it was a nightmare. We can't forget the assassin, chromopolis Michael. As much as it pains us because of how much of a fun character he is, we do have to rank him this low on our list. When he's on the job, he has no issue with killing anyone who's been tasked to him, and he really makes it clear he enjoys his work. He states himself when introducing himself to Morty that he takes any job he can. Whether it involves men, women, children, the elderly, the ill, it doesn't matter. He just likes killing people. The only saving grace that Chromopolis Michael has is that he's a pretty polite guy when he's not working on assassinating anyone. As long as you're not one of his targets, he's one of the more agreeable and civil creatures in the multiverse. Or at least he was. Moving on to the Vindicators. Sure, they take the role of superheroes, but they have very skewed morals. When Morty is going over past files, he reveals that the team lost a few members in the past. Not willing to bring Rick back to the team even though the scientist could solve their problems easily just because they didn't like dealing with the man. As they begin to die off, they show how easily they crumble when the pressure is on, turning on one another. Supernova was among the worst of them, being the single Vindicator that survived this game Rick set up, and on the verge of killing both Rick and Morty. On top of that, we learned that they willingly eliminated an entire planet just to take out an enemy because there was, quote, no other way. Except there was. They just would have had to ask Rick for help. Or almost any Rick, really. I mean, it's not like there aren't a million of him. Next up, we have another president, Evil Morty. This was a conflicting character to place. On the one hand, this Morty has a lot of plans on how to try and improve the Citadel, which we're pretty excited to see fleshed out more. Not more Morty obedience schools, trying to help Ricks work more for themselves than the jobs dictated by the corrupt Citadel, and trying to keep the two groups from turning against one another. But in the process of rising through the ranks, President Morty here has killed hundreds of Ricks and Mortys. Not to mention the torture of countless Mortys as he tried to stay in hiding, framing his own deceased Rick for the crimes. This is not a character you want to be on the wrong side of. It should be no surprise that the silver medal of evil goes to King Jellybean. He's placed this low for a very obvious reason: his attempted assault on Morty and his evident assault on children of the village he ruled in the past. I mean, the guy's statue the people erected even had him standing with a clearly uncomfortable child. At the end of the episode, when we see two of his former subjects destroying the evidence of his crimes, they state that King Jellybean had been a good ruler to them, and make the point that people would benefit more from the legacy he left. But what legacy exactly? They were poor and struggling, which was why Morty wanted to help them in the first place. And if King Jellybean was treating children in this way, we can't imagine how he made a good impression on anyone. He was a horrible ruler who got what he deserved. Our bronze medal of evil we're giving to Fart. Morty has a bad habit of seeing the good in everyone and everything, even when it's not there. As nice as Fart seems at first, he quickly shows his true colors. Able to manipulate people's emotions, he creates a morbid domino effect when he encourages an officer to take his own life rather than continue chasing Rick and Morty, which then results in many of the other officers dying in the crossfire. When Morty was saying goodbye to the gas, Fart reveals his intention to bring back all of his kind to destroy any life form that was considered lower than his own species. The way Fart says this with no emotion and pure logic, as if he's just talking about the weather, is downright unsettling. Had Morty not taken him out, Fart would no doubt have been a very powerful rival for Rick and the rest of the multiverse. But we still have to wonder if we should be worried about the rest of Fart's kind showing up at some point. But who is truly the worst of the worst? Well, it may come as a surprise, but we decided to give the gold medal of evil to Talking Cat. Yeah, we don't actually see what this feline did. For the most part, the character is mysterious. Though Talking Cat claims that it's because any answer would be unsatisfying, we can't help but wonder what it was that Rick and Jerry saw. After all, Rick has been exposed to countless terrors in his adventures. He witnessed a lot of chaos and death that made him bitter and jaded. And yet, one glance at what Talking Cat did had him flying into a rage and nearly pulled the trigger on himself, just so he didn't have to see it. There will probably be some people who point out that Rick did also show some emotion when watching the Purge planet, but even that, with people massacring each other simply because they could, Rick was sick and then got over it pretty quickly. That wasn't the case with the Talking Cat and his crimes. And for that reason alone, we decided to place this feline as the most evil character in the multiverse. But what do you think? Who is the most evil villain in Rick and Morty? Let us know in the comment section below. Don't forget to hit that notification bell and binge our Good to Evil playlist, where we break down the morality of the characters in your favorite cartoons, shows, and movies. But most importantly, stay wicked.